You know, after 30 years on the bench, sitting here in this courtroom, I thought I had seen it all. I thought I had witnessed every possible way that families could tear each other apart, every conceivable method that human beings could devise to hurt the ones who brought them into this world. But then, just when I think I've seen everything, someone like Glenn Hazelton walks into my courtroom, and I'm reminded that the capacity for family dysfunction is truly limitless. Let me tell you something about this case that I'm never going to forget. It started like so many others do, with a young man, well, not so young actually. Glenn Hazelton was 52 years old when he stood before me, a grown man with a lifetime of troubles written all over his face, in every line etched deep into his forehead, in the way his jaw clenched tight when he talked about his mother, in the way his hands trembled slightly when he gestured to make a point, and standing just a few feet away from him was his mother, Nancy Hazelton, a woman who looked every one of her 73 years with silver hair pulled back tight from her face and eyes that had seen too much, way too much, over the decades she'd spent on this earth. Now, Glenn comes into my courtroom with a lawsuit against his own mother, his own flesh and blood, the woman who gave birth to him, who changed his diapers, who probably stayed up nights worrying about him when he was sick as a little boy. And what's he suing her for? He's suing her for $2,500. That's it. $2,500, the price of a used car that'll get you from point A to point B for maybe another year before it dies completely. The price of a nice television, actually, which is ironic when you think about it, because a television is exactly what this whole mess started over. But here's the thing about my courtroom, and I've said this a million times. If you're going to come in here and ask me for money, you better have your facts straight, you better have your evidence ready, and you better be prepared to answer my questions, all of my questions, not just the ones you feel like answering, because I don't play games in here, and I don't suffer fools, and I certainly don't have any patience for people who think they can pick and choose what parts of the truth they're going to share with me. So let me set the scene for you. It's a regular day in my courtroom, the kind of day where I've already heard 3 or 4 cases, already sent a few people away with their tails between their legs, already told a few more that they better think long and hard about whether they really want to pursue whatever nonsense they've dragged in here. And then Glenn Hazelton's case is called, and he steps up to that podium with a certain swagger, a certain attitude that immediately tells me this isn't going to be one of those quick, easy cases where everyone's reasonable and we wrap things up in 15 minutes. Mr. Hazelton, I say to him, looking down at my notes, then up at his face, trying to read him, trying to figure out what makes this man tick. The defendant in this case is your mother. Is that correct? He nods, and there's something in his eyes, something I can't quite put my finger on, a mixture of anger and hurt, and maybe even a little bit of fear. That's correct, Your Honor. And it is your claim that she had you falsely arrested a little over a year ago for both stealing her property and for assaulting your sister, who tried to intervene and prevent you from taking her television. That's what this case is about, correct? He straightens up a little taller, puffs out his chest just slightly, the way people do when they're about to defend themselves against something they know looks bad on paper. That is correct, Your Honor. Now, I've been doing this long enough to know that when someone comes in here claiming they were falsely arrested, there's usually more to the story. Police don't just go around arresting people for no reason, especially not people in their 50s, especially not based solely on a mother's complaint without some kind of evidence, some kind of corroboration. So I start digging, the way I always do, because that's my job. That's what I'm here for, to get to the bottom of things, to separate the wheat from the chaff, to figure out who's telling me the truth and who's feeding me a line of bull. You spent, according to you, 6 days in jail, I continue, reading from his complaint. You finally bailed yourself out, and you want to be compensated for that time, for the money you spent on bail, for the wages you lost while you were sitting in a cell. Is that about right? He nods again, more vigorously this time. That is correct, Your Honor. 6 days of my life I'll never get back. 6 days locked up like an animal for something I didn't do. And that's when I start asking the questions that really matter, the questions that are going to tell me who this man really is, what kind of person stands before me asking for money from his own mother. Prior to being arrested last year, when you were arrested on your mother's complaint, how many times had you been arrested before? He shifts his weight from one foot to the other, glances over at his mother, then back at me. A bunch. I don't let people get away with vague answers in my courtroom. How many? More than a dozen. He thinks about it for a second, maybe counting in his head, maybe trying to figure out how to minimize it without actually lying to me. Because lying to me, that's a whole different ballgame. That's contempt of court. That's perjury. That's the kind of thing that can get you in real trouble. I could say yes, he finally admits. Now, a dozen arrests. Think about that for a minute. A dozen times that the police have picked this man up, taken him downtown, booked him, fingerprinted him, put him in a cell. A dozen times that he's had to sit and wait for someone to come bail him out, or for a judge to decide whether he gets to go home. That's not the record of an ordinary citizen. That's not the record of someone who's just had a run of bad luck. That's the record of someone with serious problems, serious issues with the law, serious issues with controlling himself. And were those, I ask him, leaning forward a little, watching his face carefully, at least some of those arrests drug-related? He shakes his head firmly. No. Were they alcohol-related? I press. No. Were they physically related? Were they assault cases? Now he hesitates just for a moment, but I catch it. Some. I can see where this is going, can see the pattern emerging, but I need him to admit it, need him to say it out loud so everyone in this courtroom can hear it. Were some of them involving theft? No. Were some of them involving trespass? No. So they were all involving assault? More than a dozen cases. I let that sink in for a moment, let the weight of it hang in the air. What I'm gathering now is information. So of the more than a dozen arrests you had, none involved drugs, none involved alcohol, none involved theft, none involved trespass, all involved assault. Is that a yes or a no? He's getting frustrated now. I can see it in the way his jaw tightens, in the way his hands clench into fists at his sides. That's a no. I raise an eyebrow. What else did they involve other than assault? And this is where he makes his first big mistake. The kind of mistake that people make when they think they're smarter than the system, when they think they can control the conversation, when they think they can tell me what we're going to talk about and what we're not. I'm just talking about this case, Your Honor, okay? He says, and there's an edge to his voice now, a defensiveness that tells me he doesn't like where this is going, doesn't like me poking around in his past, doesn't want me to see the whole picture. But here's the thing about me, and anyone who's ever been in my courtroom knows this. I don't let anyone tell me what I can and cannot ask. I don't let anyone control the narrative. I'm the one asking the questions in here. I'm the one who decides what's relevant and what's not. And if you think you can come into my courtroom and dictate the terms of our conversation, you've got another think coming. I'm talking about who the party is, I start to say, but he cuts me off, which is another mistake, a big one. I'm only talking about this case at hand, he insists, his voice rising. If you don't want to discuss this case, then we can just dismiss it. Well, I've been doing this long enough to know when someone's trying to call my bluff, trying to test me, trying to see if I'll back down. And let me tell you something, I don't bluff and I don't back down. Not ever, not for anyone. Great, I say, and I don't even hesitate. Then I'm dismissing it. Thank you very much, we're done. And I mean it. I'm done with this case, done with this man who thinks he can come into my courtroom and tell me what I can and cannot ask, done with his attitude, done with his games. Officer Byrd starts to escort the parties out, and Glenn Hazelton is standing there with his mouth open, probably thinking that I was just making a threat, that I wouldn't actually do it, that I'd call him back and give him another chance. But that's not how I operate. When I say we're done, we're done. Period. End of story. Next case, except as it turns out, it wasn't the end of the story, because about 20 minutes later, Officer Byrd comes over to me with a message. Glenn Hazelton has had second thoughts. He's realized that maybe, just maybe, he made a mistake by challenging me. He's asking if I'll reconsider, if I'll give him another chance to present his case. Now, I don't usually do this. I don't usually give people do-overs when they've disrespected my courtroom and my authority, but something about this case, something about the look on Nancy Hazelton's face, something about the dynamic between this mother and son makes me curious, makes me want to know the whole story, so I agree to bring them back in. Officer Byrd tells me that you have had second thoughts about answering the court's questions, I say to Glenn when they're both standing before me again. And you're asking me to reconsider the dismissal of this case. Is that correct? He nods, and there's a humility in his posture now that wasn't there before, a recognition that he pushed too far and almost lost his chance entirely. That is correct, Your Honor. Okay, I say, and I let the word hang there for a moment. Let him sweat just a little bit. So then, let's get back to where I was questioning you before. And I pick up right where I left off, because I'm not going to let him forget that he tried to challenge me and lost. According to your answers previously, you've been arrested at least a dozen times, none involving drugs. Is that correct? He answers more carefully now, measuring his words. That is correct. None involving alcohol. That is correct. None involving burglary. That is correct. None involving theft. That is correct. All involving assault. He hesitates, but only for a second. That is correct. 3 times. I catch that. 3 times. Not a dozen. 3 times involving assault. So what were the other 9 arrests for? But I let it go for the moment because I'm more interested in the bigger picture here. So, of the more than a dozen times you've been arrested, it's as a result of either temper or a mental illness if it wasn't drug or alcohol related. He shakes his head. No, my anger gets the best of me. Well, that's an uncontrollable issue, I observe. It's an uncontrollable issue, he agrees, and from which you've been or not been in treatment? Not in treatment, not getting help, not doing anything to address the problem that's landed him in jail more than a dozen times, just letting his anger control him, letting it ruin his life, letting it destroy his relationships. And now he's standing here blaming his mother for his latest trip to jail, asking me to give him money because of it. I turn to Nancy Hazelton, who's been standing quietly through all of this, her face a mask of stoicism that hides who knows what emotions underneath. Is it correct, Ms. Hazelton, that your son never had either a drug or an alcohol problem? And here's where things get interesting, where the story starts to shift, where I realize that maybe, just maybe, there's more to this than Glenn has been telling me, because Nancy looks at me and then looks at her son and then says one word, alcohol. Just that one word, but it changes everything, because Glenn just told me under oath that none of his arrests involved alcohol. And now his own mother is sitting here telling me otherwise. Now, I'm not saying that Nancy Hazelton is necessarily telling the truth and Glenn is lying. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that there's a discrepancy here, a big one, and I need to get to the bottom of it. Because in my courtroom, the truth matters. The truth is everything. I turn back to Glenn. In October of 2015, Mr. Hazelton, how were you supporting yourself? By working. For whom? Green Star Lawn Maintenance. How long have you worked for them? For 38 years, off and on? 38 years off and on with the same company. That's something, at least. That's stability, that's commitment, that's not the mark of someone completely unable to hold down a job. But it's the off and on part that catches my attention, because that suggests that there have been gaps, periods when he wasn't working, periods when something got in the way. Are you working for them now? Yes. Full time? Yes. In the same location? Yes. I look over at Nancy. Is that correct? She nods, but there's something in her expression, something I can't quite read. I think so. Do you remember on what day you were arrested? I asked Glenn. Yeah, I was arrested on May 6, 2015. Where? Hennepin County. Is that where you live? I lived, yes. Past tense. Interesting. He lived there. Past tense. What time were you arrested? After about 12:20. In the morning? In the morning, yeah. And you were at home? I was at home, right. And you were arrested on the complaint of your mother and or your sister, or just your mother? Now Glenn launches into his version of events, and I let him tell it. Let him get it all out, because I want to hear what he has to say, want to understand how he sees this situation. I was arrested on my mother and sister's complaint, stating that I walked in an unlocked door, used the restroom. Upon leaving the restroom, stole the TV out of my mom's room, hit my sister 3 times in the face, and left with the TV. I processed this information, filing it away for later. Okay. You're the sister? I ask, looking at Nancy. No. Where is the sister? And this is where the story takes another turn, another twist that I wasn't expecting, because Nancy Hazelton looks down at the floor, and when she looks up again, there are tears in her eyes, tears she's trying hard to hold back. She's passed away. The sister is dead. The sister who allegedly witnessed this crime, who allegedly was assaulted by her brother, who allegedly called the police to report what happened, is no longer here to tell her side of the story. She can't be cross-examined. She can't be questioned. She can't confirm or deny anything that's been said about that night. Were you at home that day? I asked Nancy. No. So the sister that you allegedly assaulted is no longer here, I say, turning back to Glenn. No. Is that correct? I asked Nancy. That is correct. And I gather from your answer that you were not at home when this took place, I say to Nancy. No. Did you have a conversation with your daughter when you got home? And here's where Nancy starts to tell her story, the story of what she came home to on that night in May. She was holding an ice, she begins, but I cut her off because I need to establish the timeline first. Need to understand exactly when everything happened. Just a second. At what time did you get home on, it would be the 5th of May? Right. What time did you get home? Between probably 9:30 and 9:45. I was playing bingo. Bingo. A 73-year-old woman playing bingo on a Tuesday night, minding her own business, having a good time with her friends, not knowing that when she gets home, her life is about to be turned upside down. And at that time, Ms. Hazelton, who did you live with? My daughter lived with me. How old was she? Nancy thinks for a moment, calculating. Let's see. She was 52. I hold up my hand to silence Glenn, who's trying to interject. She was 50 then? I ask Nancy. Yeah. So when you came home, it was 9:30, 9:45. And tell me first what you saw. Nancy takes a deep breath, and I can see that this is hard for her, that reliving this moment is painful, that talking about her daughter, her deceased daughter, is bringing up emotions she's probably been trying to keep buried. I saw her holding an ice pack on her face, and I asked her what happened. And she said, Glenn came here to use the bathroom, so she let him in. And in the process of using the restroom, he came out with my 32-inch TV, and she went to stop him, and he hit her in the face. That's what she told me. She pauses, and her voice gets quieter. And I was only in the house maybe 5 minutes before the police were knocking on the doors. Had your daughter called the police? I ask. Yes. So she had called the police before you even got home? Oh, yes. Now, this is important because it means that the complaint was made while the events were still fresh, while the alleged victim was still holding an ice pack to her face, before anyone had a chance to coordinate stories, before anyone could pressure her to change her account. This is the kind of contemporaneous reporting that carries weight, that suggests credibility. Do you have the police report? I ask Nancy. No, I don't have that. I turn to Glenn. Do you have the police report? He nods. Yes, I do. I'd like to see it, sir. He fumbles through his papers, and I wait, because I know that police reports tell a story that neither party can control, that they document what the officers saw, what they were told, what they observed. And when Glenn finally hands it over, when I start reading through it, I see things that make me look up at him with new eyes. You do know that these reports indicate that you were totally uncooperative, had to be placed in a hood, a spit hood, had to be put in isolation area. He starts to interrupt. Excuse me, Your Honor, but I'm not finished. Are you telling me that you were not high on some sort of drug or alcohol that night when they came to your home to arrest you? Excuse me, Your Honor. Let me first say this. I asked you a question, Mr. Hazelton. And now the dam breaks. Now all the anger and frustration and indignation that's been building up inside him comes pouring out in a torrent of words that I can barely keep up with. No, I was not high. No, I was not high. No, I was not on no drugs, okay? My actions speak louder than words. I was arrested, hauled off to jail, ripped out of my bed in my underwear, and you're telling me for a crime I did not commit. How would you react? He's breathing hard now, his face flushed with emotion. And the charges were dismissed not by the judge, by the public defender, the state's attorney, because I didn't steal the TV that my mom said. And my mother sat there and said she's seen me in a while. She hasn't seen me in 7 years. And it came out of her in the police report. She states that. And my sister said 2 different times. She said she came home with an ice pack, but there's no bruises or marks on her. I hit her 3 times. It's all a lie. He's practically shouting now, his voice echoing off the walls of my courtroom. And why don't they look in her question and call me and ask me, did I do this? They know where I live, you know. They're trying to give me 46 years for this TV. My life is a little more than 46 years, okay? Or acting out in jail or whatever. I didn't do it, And this is the reason I'm suing my mother. I'm out $2,500. I could have gone after her for penal damages. And when he's finally done, when he's finally said everything he has to say, I look at him for a long moment, and then I say the words that I know are going to crush him, the words that are going to send him out of my courtroom with nothing. Your case is dismissed, Mr. Hazelton. You have no case against your mother. We're finished. He stands there for a moment, stunned, unable to process what I've just said. What do you mean, dismissed? I haven't even, but I've already moved on, already called the next case, already signaled to Officer Byrd that it's time for the Hazelton family to leave my courtroom because I've heard enough. I've seen enough. And I know with the certainty that comes from 30 years on the bench that this case never should have been brought in the first place. But let me explain to you why I dismissed this case, because I think it's important. I think people need to understand how I think, how I make my decisions, what factors I consider when I'm sitting up here trying to figure out who's telling the truth and who's not. First of all, there's Glenn's criminal history. More than a dozen arrests, most of them involving assault. That's not the record of an innocent man who's been repeatedly victimized by a vindictive mother. That's the record of someone with serious anger issues, serious impulse control problems, serious difficulty managing his emotions in a way that doesn't land him in handcuffs. And when someone with that kind of history is accused of assault, I have to take that accusation seriously because patterns exist for a reason, because people tend to repeat the same behaviors over and over again until they do something to change them, which Glenn admitted he's never done. Second, there's the fact that the charges were dismissed. Glenn keeps pointing to this as proof that he was innocent, that the whole thing was a lie. But here's the thing about dismissals that people don't always understand. Charges get dismissed for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with actual innocence. Prosecutors dismiss cases when they don't think they can prove them beyond a reasonable doubt, when witnesses become unavailable, when they have bigger cases to focus on, when they decide that the resources required aren't worth the potential outcome. A dismissal is not a finding of innocence. It's not a declaration that the defendant didn't do it. It's simply a decision not to pursue the case further for whatever reason. And in this case, the key witness, the sister who was allegedly assaulted, died before the case could go to trial. Without her testimony, without her there to be cross-examined, to tell her story, to face her accuser, the prosecutor probably decided that they couldn't prove the case. That's not the same as Glenn being innocent. That's just the reality of how the criminal justice system works. Third, there's the police report itself, which paints a picture of a man who was completely out of control when the officers arrived to arrest him. A spit hood, isolation, uncooperative behavior. That's not how innocent people usually react to being arrested. Innocent people might be angry, might be upset, might protest their innocence loudly and repeatedly, but they don't usually need to be restrained with special equipment designed to prevent them from spitting on officers. They don't usually need to be isolated from other prisoners because they're too dangerous or too volatile to be around other people. Fourth, there's the timeline. The sister called the police before Nancy even got home from bingo. That means she called immediately while the events were still happening or just after they occurred. That's not the behavior of someone who's making up a story. That's the behavior of someone who's been victimized and wants help, wants protection, wants the police to come and make things right. And fifth, there's the sheer implausibility of Glenn's story. According to him, his mother and sister conspired to have him arrested for a crime he didn't commit, a crime involving a television that he supposedly didn't take, an assault that he supposedly didn't commit. But why? What possible motive would they have? Nancy Hazelton is a 73-year-old woman who, according to Glenn himself, hadn't seen him in 7 years before this incident. Why would she suddenly decide to destroy her son's life? Why would her daughter, a 52-year-old woman, agree to participate in such a scheme, to claim that she'd been assaulted, to hold an ice pack to her face and pretend to be injured, to call the police and make a false report? And then there's the fact that the sister is now dead, which means she can't be questioned about any of this, can't be forced to defend herself against these accusations. Glenn is essentially asking me to believe that a dead woman, a woman who can't speak for herself, conspired with her mother to ruin his life. And he wants me to give him money based on that story. No, absolutely not. not in my courtroom, not ever. But here's what really bothers me about this case. What's been bothering me ever since the Hazelton family walked out of my courtroom? It's not about the money. It's not about the television. It's not even about the arrest or the 6 days Glenn spent in jail. It's about what this case represents, what it says about the state of this family, about the relationship between this mother and this son. Think about it. Glenn Hazelton is 52 years old. He spent his entire adult life, more than 3 decades, getting arrested over and over again, mostly for assault. He's never gotten treatment for his anger issues, never done anything to address the problem that keeps landing him in trouble. And now he's standing in a courtroom, suing his own mother for money, accusing her of destroying his life, while she stands just a few feet away, a 73-year-old woman who's already buried one child, who came home from playing bingo to find her daughter holding an ice pack to her face, who had to watch as the police arrested her son for hurting her other child. Where's the accountability in that? Where's the self-reflection? Where's the moment where Glenn looks at himself and says, maybe I have a problem, maybe I need help. Maybe the common denominator in all of these arrests, in all of these incidents, in all of these conflicts is me. Because I'll tell you something, and this is true in every case I've ever heard, in every dispute I've ever adjudicated. When you have problems with everyone in your life, when you're constantly in conflict with the people closest to you, when you've been arrested more than a dozen times and every single arrest involves the same kind of behavior, the problem isn't everyone else. The problem is you. I'm not saying that Nancy Hazelton is perfect. I'm not saying that she was the world's greatest mother, that she never made mistakes, that she never contributed to the dysfunction in her family. I don't know enough about their history to make that kind of judgment. But I do know that on that night in May, she came home to a situation that she didn't create, to a daughter who'd been hurt, to a son who'd been arrested, and she told the police what her daughter told her. That's what any mother would do. That's what any decent human being would do. And now, instead of taking responsibility for his own actions, instead of looking in the mirror and asking himself why his life has turned out this way, instead of getting the help he so clearly needs, Glenn is in my courtroom, pointing fingers, placing blame, demanding money from the woman who gave him life. Well, he's not getting it, not from me, not today. But here's what I hope, and I'm not often hopeful about these things, after 30 years of seeing the worst that people can do to each other, but here's what I hope. I hope that somewhere deep down, Glenn hears what I'm saying. I hope that when he walks out of my courtroom, he thinks about what I told him. I hope that he realizes that the only person who can change his life, the only person who can break this cycle of anger and violence and arrest is him. I hope that he gets help. I hope that he finds a way to control his temper, to manage his emotions, to be the man that he could have been, that he should have been, that maybe, just maybe, he still can be. Because the alternative is too sad to contemplate. The alternative is more arrests, more jail time, more alienation from the few family members who are still willing to have anything to do with him. The alternative is a life that gets smaller and smaller until there's nothing left but anger and bitterness and regret. And Nancy Hazelton, what about her? She goes home to an empty house now, probably, since her daughter is gone. She goes home to memories of that night, to the knowledge that her son was arrested for hurting her daughter, to the pain of having to testify against her own child, to the grief of losing one child while the other seems determined to destroy himself. She goes home to a life that's been shaped by forces she couldn't control, by decisions she didn't make, by a son who can't or won't get his act together. That's the tragedy of this case, the thing that will stay with me long after Glenn Hazelton has forgotten my name in my courtroom. It's not about the television. It's not about the $2,500. It's about a family that's been broken beyond repair, about a mother and son who should be supporting each other but instead are tearing each other apart, about a cycle of violence and blame that shows no signs of ending. I've seen it 1,000 times. I'll probably see it 1,000 more before I'm done. But it never gets easier. It never stops hurting to watch families destroy themselves, to watch people throw away relationships that should be the most important things in their lives, to watch anger and pride and stubbornness triumph over love and forgiveness and understanding. So I dismissed the case. I sent them both home with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the weight of their history pressing down on them. And I truly hope that something changes, that Glenn gets help, that Nancy finds peace, that somehow, against all odds, this family finds a way to heal. But I'm not holding my breath, and neither should you, because in the end, the only person who can change your life is you. The only person who can break the cycle is you. The only person who can choose a different path, a better path, a path that leads away from anger and toward peace is you. And until you make that choice, until you decide that you're tired of living the way you've been living, tired of hurting the people who love you, tired of the arrests and the jail time and the endless, exhausting cycle of conflict and blame, nothing will change. Not the courts, not the judges, not the system. Nothing. That's the lesson of this case. That's what I hope everyone who hears about Glenn and Nancy Hazelton takes away from this story. You can blame your mother, your father, your sister, your brother, your boss, your neighbor, the government, the system, the world. You can point fingers until your arm falls off. But at the end of the day, the only person responsible for your life is you. And until you accept that, until you own that, until you take responsibility for who you are and what you've done and where you're going, nothing will ever change. Not the arrests, not the anger, not the pain, nothing. So, go home, Glenn Hazelton. Go home and think about what I've said. Go home and look in the mirror. Go home and decide once and for all whether you're going to keep living the way you've been living or whether you're going to finally do something different. The choice is yours. It's always been yours. It will always be yours. And until you make it, don't come back to my courtroom because I've got nothing left to say to you. Nothing at all. We're finished.